Thank you. Good morning, everyone. You're my experimental group here. I've actually never given this talk before. Usually, I think Aubrey can probably relate to that. You get to kind of spin your talks different directions for different groups, but this is actually brand new, so you're my guinea pigs here. My topic is, as you can see, how to sustain an organization for over a century. That's because the challenge here is that we don't know how long it's going to take to be able to repair, revive, and rehabilitate cryopreserved patients, but it's going to be decades at least. Unless you're a hardcore singularity guy, then you might think it might be sooner, but I don't think that's likely. It could easily be a century. The problem is, when you ask how many organizations have actually lasted for a century or more, you get kind of a depressing answer, but some have. So how do they manage that, and what might we learn from that? What can we actually do practically in the design of our organizations? How long have current cryonics organizations existed? Well, that's actually kind of encouraging because there are 3 that have been around for a fair number of years, although one of them is arguably not really around, it kind of is. The American Cryonics Society has been around the longest, since 1969, but although it's officially still there and offers membership, almost all its patients are now stored elsewhere, and it has a very low level of activity, but it does still exist. The second longest lived one is the Alcor Foundation, which was founded in 1972, followed by the Cryonics Institute in 1976. So that's actually not bad. That's around 4 decades or so is fairly good compared to most organizations. So how long do organizations tend to last? Well, actually, it's pretty hard to answer that question. There's all kinds of data on different kinds of organization. There seems to be a lot of disagreement. But it seems, for instance, when Mike Darwin addressed this issue, I'm not sure where he came up with this number, but he figured out the odds of a corporation, a specific kind of organization, surviving for 100 years or more is about 1% or 1.5%. And that may be over-optimistic. I'm not sure where that number came from. If you go to look at, as I'll say, a little bit longer, if you look at larger corporations, they tend to live longer than short ones. There's a very high infant mortality rate for organizations. Almost all of them die off in the first 3 or 5 years. And once you get past that and you start growing to a certain size, your chances become a little bit better. I'll talk a little bit more about that when I get to business organizations. Now, some of the oldest organizations are academic and religious organizations, but there are a smattering and kind of interesting cases in financial and business areas. Come back to that. So academic institutions, those really are some of the longest lived ones. And I can kind of have a little interesting personal angle on this because it happens that I've been to some pretty old schools. The school I went to, I'm not sure how Germans describe it, but I guess in America it would be the combination of junior high school and high school, basically ages 10 to 16. That school is actually celebrating its 425th year. Next month I'll be going over there for a reunion. So that's pretty old for a school of that type. And after that I went to the University of Oxford, which actually is the 2nd oldest university in the world that's continuously existed, being founded in 1096. So that's quite a long time. The oldest, by the way, apparently, that's still existing and continuously existing is the University of Bologna, which was founded in 1088. So there are a few others. When it gets down to the title of 3rd oldest university, people get all squabbling about that and they can't agree, and there's about 4 or 5 contenders. But basically those are the oldest ones, followed by Cambridge at 1209. But how relevant is that? It's not clear how relevant that would be for cryonics organizations because academic institutions in most countries have been either funded or supported by the state or by religions. There are very few commercial ones, and those tend to be very recent creations. So it's not very clear how that relates to cryonics organizations. I think there is some possible lessons in terms of how they manage their finances and endowments, but it's probably not a very direct relationship. Now, it could be that maybe that relationship could be closer in the future. It's inconceivable now, but can you imagine that one day it's possible that cryonics organizations might be backed by governments? That seems, you're talking crazy, man. Cryonics is this bizarre idea that nobody is into, governments aren't going to support it. Well, that's true today, but things do change. And maybe at some point, governments will see this as a major thing that people support, they need to get behind. And they might think, wow, look at this. People spend all this money on end-of-life care. What if we started supporting cryonics organizations, and instead of people extending their lives a few miserable months costing huge amounts of money, we encourage them to be cryopreserved and perhaps even help fund that? That would cut our medical costs enormously, and that's a hugely growing proportion of national expenditures. So maybe that's not completely crazy at some point in the future. But right now, academic institutions may be not such a good model. Now, religious organizations There are a number of different kinds. I think the ones that are least interesting are old churches like Westminster Abbey or St. Peter's Basilica, which is also arguable if that's continuously existed. It was actually rebuilt. Those aren't very interesting because they're very kind of narrow. Basically, they're buildings, but they have a kind of organization around them. But you might say, what about something like the Catholic Church, which you might say has a pretty good claim on being one of the oldest, having been around fairly continuously for a couple of thousand years almost, and about 1,000 years in its current institutional form, its current structure. Now that's obviously a religion, but it's built on certain core values that people have in common. So we might think there's some kind of possible lesson for cryonics organizations, but they tend to be managed in a rather different way from anything that we would look forward to. But they do have to survive long term, so there might be some interesting lessons there. And that's an open question as to how relevant they are. Some other pretty old ones, I kind of like this one just because it's got an interesting name. Actually, there's two of them. The Sacred and Imperial Monastery of the God-trodden Mount of Mount Sinai, or more easily, St. Catherine's, in Egypt, which was built somewhere between 548 and 565. So that's been operating continuously for about 1,200 years. That's pretty impressive. And it has library books on hand that date back to the 4th century. So they managed to survive a really long time. Another one that I mentioned, Mike Darwin had talked a little bit about this in one of his blog posts. His favorite is the Jura Europos Church, the earliest identified Christian house church. And that was apparently based on a house that was converted into a place of worship somewhere between 233 and 256. So that's been a pretty long time. But I think a little bit more relevant, maybe we start looking at financial organizations. Now, why is that relevant? Well, obviously, cryonics depends a lot on some fairly sophisticated funding over the very long term. Individual members who are members of organizations have to plan their financing. They have to be able to pay for their cryopreservation at a point that could be decades from the present when they make the arrangements. And then you have to take into account inflation, financial crashes, all kinds of issues like that, personal crises. How can you be assured that you have that money in the long term? And the cryonics organizations themselves obviously have to allow for the same kinds of problems. We need to have money for patient care that has to last for a long, long time, maybe a century, maybe more. How do you do that? How do you assure enough growth in your funds? How do you take enough risk to get growth while also assuring that the money is not going to disappear in the next financial crisis? So I'll talk a little bit about what's actually being done right now by cryonics organizations. These are also interesting, maybe more than academic or religious organizations, because they have more of the traditional corporate structure. And cryonics organizations do have a corporate structure. They tend to be non-profits, which, as we'll see as we go through examples, is probably a good thing for long-term survival. It seems that many of these organizations that have lasted a long time are non-profit. They're not run for the profit of shareholders. They don't have to worry about quarterly earnings and reporting to investors in the short term. One of the oldest insurance companies or insurance markets is Lloyd's of London, which actually started off in a coffee shop where people got together to buy and sell insurance and talk about it over coffee back in 1688. Of course, that's grown and expanded over the years. But banks, of course, are actually the oldest organizations. The oldest surviving bank being the Banca Monte del Paschi di Siena. That is Italy's third largest bank, but it's the oldest surviving bank, founded in 1472. Now that one, I'm not sure how much we can learn from. It was, I actually don't know enough about the structure, but it was founded by the magistrate of the city of Siena. And so it probably has a lot of government links, maybe backed by taxes. So maybe more interesting is the second oldest bank, the John Berenberg Goslar and Company, commonly known as Berenberg Bank. So a German multinational financial institution. It's based in Hamburg. It's mostly a merchant bank, does some private banking. It's the world's second oldest bank overall, the oldest German bank, founded in 1590. And what's interesting about this, and this theme kept coming up as I was looking at these organizations, this bank has been continuously owned by the descendants of the founders. So it's all been run in the family, or actually three families. It's kind of a Hanseatic family dynasty, three different families all linked together, which have managed this bank over all these decades and centuries. It's actually organized as a limited partnership with personally liable partners. So it's kind of a recognizable modern form of business organization, but with remarkable longevity. The next one, the fourth oldest one, the Citibank loan in Amsterdam, is a municipal institution. So again, it's got links to city government, which makes it maybe not so relevant, but it's a non-profit institution. And it's relatively small, with 85 people employed after all that time. And there's some other examples that I won't necessarily go into, but I want to mention C. Hoare and Company. That's H-O-A-R-E, not W-H-O-R-E, even though we're talking about money. That's an English private bank, founded by the Hoares, Sir Richard Hoare. That remains family-owned and is managed currently by the 11th generation of the family. Now, what struck me about that as being pretty amazing was, can you imagine having 11 generations of a family without having at least one generation who's completely crazy or homicidal or corrupt, who would destroy your family business? It's pretty hard to imagine you get through 11 generations. How many of you have families going back 11 generations with not one nutty, crazy person who will probably destroy your institution? That's pretty remarkable. So I imagine they have some kind of safeguards in place in case they do get the crazy relative, so they can survive that. But this is a recurring theme in a lot of these old organizations. They are basically run by families or have some other very tight-knit connection in terms of ideology or worldview. The board, by the way, just to think about the structure, the board is comprised of 7 shareholding partners, all of whom are descendants of the bank's founder, but also with 5, so a minority non-family directors, including the non-executive chairman and chief executive officer. Now there's another one, another financial institution of long standing that also has a family basis, the B. Metzler Seal Sun and Company, which I'm probably butchering, headed by a certain holding company whose entire capital is held by the original Metzler family. And that was founded back in 1674. So again, a lot of a family business, basically. So there's a bunch of others that we could go through, but in many of these cases, it seems that they have family, organized by families, or else they have some kind of government, city-based backing, or they're non-profits. That seems to be the basis. Now, to look at business organizations more generally, how long do businesses last? That's a really hard question to answer. It seems that, as I mentioned earlier, infant mortality is very high. So if you start up a new business, you're probably going to be gone within 3 or 4 or 5 years. The majority of businesses go under in that time. Exactly how many, it seems a little hard to say. Maybe 80% have gone within 10 years. A Dun & Bradstreet report said that for small businesses with fewer than 20 employees, they only have a 37% chance of surviving 4 years and 9% of surviving 10 years. So that's not very good. We have to do better than that for cryonics organizations. Now, if you look at larger corporations, and hopefully cryonics organizations will become gigantic corporations at some point. Right now, we're pretty tiny. We're certainly larger than the average new restaurant, so we've already passed that point. So if you look at the S&P 500, for instance, and we might hope to be part of that group one day, that looks a bit more impressive. It used to be, if you go to older books, they would say that the average lifespan of the S&P 500 was something like 67 years. But the bad news is, over the last few decades, that longevity has crashed. It's gone from 67 years, and it's dropped to about 15 years now. So if you look at the current membership of the S&P 500 or any other group of large corporations, the chances that you'll recognize many of those companies in 15 or 20 years is pretty small. They go under. Another study from 2002 from an Amsterdam group estimated, and this seems overly optimistic actually, but this is what they came up with, the average life expectancy of all firms, regardless of size, measured in Japan and much of Europe, was 12.5 years. So again, that's pretty dismal for long-term survival. Now, one point I have to make though, in these numbers, these count an organization as not surviving if they're acquired or merged or broken up. But that shouldn't actually be a critical measure for cryonics organizations, because if you merge with another cryonics organization and maybe get a new name, that doesn't mean you've lost your patients or your money. It just means that the corporate identity has changed. If you have to give up your patients to another organization, for instance, American Cryonics Society transferred almost all of its patients to Cryonics Institute, they're still being cared for. So as long as the financial end of things is in place, that doesn't mean that the death of a nominal organization means the death of the members, the end of their chances. So that's a little bit more optimistic, even though these large companies don't last hugely long, not much more than a couple of decades. It doesn't mean that their purpose has been abandoned. It doesn't mean necessarily bad news for us. Now, some corporations, some businesses that are for profit have actually lasted a very long time, and they're some of the most interesting ones. There's actually an organization in England, which I didn't know of until fairly recently, called the Tercentenarians. This is a very special trade group, and to become a member, you have to have existed for 300 years or longer and have been operated by the same family, although they've bent that rule a little bit lately, I think. But basically, you have to be 300 years or older. And so they sit around, over whiskey or beer and saying, oh, I've been around for 362 years. Oh, really, old chap, I've been around for 547. So they're all kind of show off and one-up each other like that. But that's pretty remarkable. There's actually enough of them to support a trade organization like that. And think about that. It lasts over 300 years. You have to have survived about 50 recessions, 2 world wars, the start of the Industrial Revolution, numerous stock market crashes, and Napoleon, and so on, and the internet. So some pretty huge disruptions over that time. How the heck do you manage that? Well, what's interesting about these organizations is they're pretty small. I think the largest of them has about 600 employees. That's the largest, and many of them are a lot smaller than that. Some of them are like individual shops. So it's not clear what we can learn from those. But again, many of those tend to be maintained by the same family. And one question I'll kind of have at the end of this sort of question to you, how can we fake that? Because we're not run by families. Can we fake it somehow? Can we have something in place of family ownership? One real outlier, and this is kind of sad because this just died in 2006, it was absorbed. The Kongo Gumi Company in Japan had been operating continuously for 1,428 years. Imagine that, a construction company. 1,428 years. That's amazing. They started off building temples, and then when they had to, they built other things. So they survived essentially by being adaptable, but sticking with their basic business for as long as they could. But during World War II, for instance, when there was no demand for building temples or anything like that, they switched to building coffins. Plenty of coffins needed building. So that's pretty smart. Unfortunately, they screwed up. They went against one of the clear tenets that we'll discuss later of what do you have to do to survive. One of those is good fiscal management. Unfortunately, their borrowings ballooned up to $343 million in 2006, and that was the end of them. They got absorbed by Takamatsu, a large Japanese construction company. However, they still exist as a wholly owned subsidiary. So are they still around? Well, kind of. Just a couple of others. The Marinelli Bell Foundry in Italy has been in operation for over 1,000 years. Again, owned by the same family throughout that whole time. And using the same lost wax method of casting. So this is an area that hasn't had a lot of technological innovation. They've managed to survive in that little area. Going to the New World, where we don't really have many old organizations. One of the oldest is the Tuttle Farm in New Hampshire. This, again, a family business, family to family, now in the 11th generation. Again, amazing that they managed to stay sane for 11 generations, but they have. They must have brought in good genes from elsewhere, I guess. Began in the 1630s when John Tuttle got a land grant from King Charles II and started up his farm. So again, a family business. There's some other ones, from ones like Beretta, which is the oldest firearms sales company, which has actually been going since 1526. Again, owned by family members. Essentially, father to son for a long time until, I think, the current generation, where that was interrupted slightly, when assumed control by an uncle who married into the family. So the same name was adopted, and now it's going down through his generations. But basically the same family over several centuries. Now, it seemed, I've read claims that in Japan there are more than 20,000 companies that are more than 100 years old. I haven't been able to verify that. That's something I need to dig into further. And I get a little bit suspicious after recent stories that the supposedly huge centenarian population of Japan is actually fake. And it's because the government hasn't actually checked records, and actually when they have, it turns out that many of these supposed centenarians actually died 20 years ago, but their families are still collecting benefits. So I don't think we actually have reliable numbers on old Japanese individuals, so I'm not sure about the companies. There might be less reason to fake it for companies, but supposedly 20,000 companies more than 100 years old. And again, those tend to be companies that are small, mostly family-run, and tend to focus on a central belief or credo that is not solely tied to making a profit. So even though they're in the form of a for-profit organization, that's not their sole focus. It's not maybe the main focus. So there's other things we could look at, things like the Iceland Parliament, which has been around since about 1520, Parliament of Britain, about 1520, Imperial House of Japan, 660 BC. They're probably not very relevant to what we want. So what can we learn from this kind of brief survey of these old organizations? Well, not a whole lot. I'm going to draw on some work by Dutch business expert R.A. de Goes, if I'm pronouncing that right. Never actually hear these names spoken, I just read them. He looked at some of the oldest organizations, but his methodology is very limited. He actually only looked at, I think, 30 companies, which is